My name is Phil Jordan, and I'm a catchment scientist in the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Ulster University. And this presentation is on managing freshwater eutrophication. Now, freshwaters are an important resource in Northern Ireland, and we have around 450 river water bodies, 21 lake water bodies over 50 hectares, although we've many thousands of smaller water bodies, lakes in the border region. And we have about 75 separate groundwater bodies determined by local geology. And these water bodies have many different uses, from recreation to fisheries, drinking water supplies, and as biodiversity reserves. So they're very important. And one of the principal impacts of our freshwaters is eutrophication, or the overnourishment by a nutrient. And those nutrients for freshwater are generally phosphorus, for marine waters generally nitrogen. And what happens when excess phosphorus or nitrogen goes into these water bodies? We get ultimately an increase in plant biomass in that system. Now, this is an important lake water body in Northern Ireland, Lough Neagh, and you can see that it's surrounded by agricultural land with a few urban centres. There's Antrim Town in the northeast, Craigavon in the southeast, and on the surface of the lake you can just see a faint algal bloom growth caused by the inputs of nutrients through the 6 principal rivers that run into Lough Neagh. Lough Neagh is eutrophic. It is in fact hypertrophic. According to definitions, it's been hypertrophic for many decades. This is a worldwide phenomenon. This is one of the small lakes off Lake Erie in the northern United States, Lake St. Clair. And you can see 2 principal rivers, one coming in from the west, one coming in from the northeast, and nutrients coming in from those rivers, from the surrounding agricultural and urban centres, and algal blooms all around the edge. Now, the rest of this presentation is about phosphorus as one of those nutrients that causes eutrophication in our fresh waters. And it's a crucial nutrient, and it's also a wicked problem. So we'll talk about the nutrient and about the wicked problem as well. So phosphorus is a chemical element. It's a rare element in the Earth's crust, 0.1% of it, but it's essential to life through the phosphate ion at DNA, RNA, and cellular levels. It's a nutrient that's used in modern industrial agriculture, and for primary production, that's the growth of grass or crops, and secondary production, grazing or feed for animals for meat and eggs and milk and so on. It's also essential for our healthy bodies and bones, so it's an essential nutrient in the food supply. And as an element, as a nutrient for use in agriculture, it's derived from fossil reserves in specific places around the world. And it's also in slurry and manure as part of that food cycle, food chain. So we can say it's a byproduct in animal slurry and manure, and it's also a byproduct of human sewage through the food chain. Well, the wicked problem. We need it in our soils as plant available phosphorus, and we measure that in parts per million. So that could be milligrams per litre of dried soil, for example. But if small amounts are lost from soils to water, small amounts are discharged in sewage, measured in parts per billion, so an even smaller amount, then we could get a water quality problem. And that's a wicked problem. So we need this, but it causes an issue somewhere else. And the more we need it and the more we use it, the more that other issue becomes a problem. So that's a wicked problem. Now, phosphorus as a pollution source leaves soils across the landscape in a diffuse process. That means it's not from a particular point in the landscape, it's from many points, and driven largely by rainfall and runoff processes. So as rainfall wets the soil up and that water becomes saturated to the surface and runs over the surface as overland flow, it takes with it soil particles and dissolved phosphorus and other things as well, and that manifests as these overland flow areas, which then make their way down into streams, watercourses, and maybe ultimately lakes as well. So a way that phosphorus can leave the land in overland flow through these rainfall runoff processes is something we've called incidental. That is that, this good management of applying slurry back to the land that's full of macronutrients, if that was to happen during rainfall periods or rainfall was to occur shortly afterwards, there's a good chance that slurry with its nutrients, including phosphorus, will be mobilized in overland flow and find its way to watercourses and into lakes. So the way we get around that in terms of policy is to generally prohibit slurry spreading during the times of year when we're going to get most of those rainfall runoff processes, and that's during the winter. So we introduce in the Nutrients Action Programme a closed period for slurry spreading, and that's generally between mid-October and the end of January, just to try to avoid most of that rainfall runoff during the winter period. Now, a little more difficult to conceptualize and to manage is legacy phosphorus in the soil, and that's phosphorus that's been added year on year to build up soil fertility, and this is a good thing. So let's just try to explain that through this cartoon on the right hand side here. On the x-axis we've got some conceptual ideas of soil phosphorus at a low level, a medium level and a high level. So phosphorus is fairly deficient at this end of the scale, and the increase in yield, whether that's in grass or barley or sugar beet or whatever it is quite low. So we add phosphorus into the soil and the phosphorus builds up in the soil, the available phosphorus, and the yields start to increase and they get very good. And they eventually get to a shoulder where the more phosphorus you put in, you'll get no extra return in the yield. So this becomes then an accumulating store of phosphorus that's available to plants, but which plants don't take up because they're limited by some other condition, and that could be to do with the soil or the environment, other environmental conditions. So there's a point in which yield doesn't increase with an increasing availability of soil phosphorus. We call that a legacy store of phosphorus. Now, on the other hand, we get phosphorus coming off in runoff in those overland flow processes, and at this end of the scale, when we've got low phosphorus in the soil, we get low phosphorus in the runoff. And at the other end of the scale, as the phosphorus in the soil becomes high, so does the phosphorus in the runoff. So there's a problem in that this is below optimum soil fertility and water quality is pretty good, but on this end of the scale we've got phosphorus that's not doing anything in terms of increased yields, but phosphorus in runoff is high. So we can summarize that by saying high soil phosphorus gives you high losses to water, and low soil phosphorus gives us low losses to water but also low soil fertility. So two states exist in these graphs, and this is a theoretical graph, but it's taken from good science, which shows exactly these growth response curves and also these phosphorus in runoff curves over soil. So the first point this shoulder period is the optimum soil phosphorus for food production. Any less phosphorus in the soil, we lower the yields. Any higher in the phosphorus, we don't increase the yield. So it's the optimum point. And the second point here on this side is a critical soil phosphorus concentration for water quality risk. Any higher than this point, and even though we're not going to increase our yields, we will increase the phosphorus in runoff, which will lead to eutrophication. So we can summarise that by saying the space in between really is the sweet spot. And that's theoretical, but we can put some numbers on that. And we can say that a concentration of available soil phosphorus, that's the phosphorus that the plants can utilise, is around about 16 to 25 milligrams of phosphorus per litre of dried soil. Okay, and that test is done in a laboratory. So let's look at the utility of knowing this information, that 26 milligrams per litre is a threshold above which we're likely to see a water quality problem, but no yield, increase in yield. So this case study is from Northern Ireland, and in fact it's the Upper Bann catchment in County Down that stretches from the Mournes down towards Banbridge. And that's the catchment in a little bit more detail, and the blue lines are all the rivers and tributaries. And there's an outlet point down here that goes, the river then goes on to Banbridge. And also the coloured areas are just elevation. So the darker area here is around the Mournes, Slieve Crwb at this end, and then the shallower areas around the river valleys. And we've got the red delineations here of each individual subcatchment that's been used as a study area in the Upper Bann by the Agri-Food Biosciences Institute in Belfast. So 13 of those where there's a target river concentration in the whole river of 48 micrograms per litre. And that is parts per billion, 48 parts per billion of phosphorus in water that's measured over a period of a year. So any less than that and the water quality is better. Any more than that and the water quality is moderate. And so 48 is the boundary between good and moderate chemical water quality. That specific river. So our three questions in this particular study was, what is the river phosphorus in each of the subcatchments? If we've got a target at the outlet of 48 micrograms per litre, what is it in each of the subcatchments over a period of a year? And the second question was, what is the soil phosphorus concentration in each field and each subcatchment? So that means going to every single field in each subcatchment and measuring the soil phosphorus concentration to see where it fits on that range below 16 milligrams per litre or above 26. And question 3, what proportion of a subcatchment or a farm can have high soil phosphorus in the fields? So, what proportion can be higher than that 26 milligrams per litre before a water quality problem becomes clear? So let's look at some results. And before I put some data on this chart, let's make sure we know what everything means here. On the x-axis is a percentage term, and this is the percentage of the subcatchment where the available phosphorus is greater or equal to that threshold, 26 milligrams of phosphorus per litre of dried soil, 26 milligrams per litre. And on the y-axis is the mean annual concentration in each river of each subcatchment, bearing in mind we had 13 subcatchments. And that's measured in a scale from 50 to 250 parts per billion or micrograms per litre. So let's look at the data. Before we put the data on, let's think about this dashed line. So that's the target threshold at 48 micrograms per litre, below which water is considered to be chemically good, and above which it's considered to be chemically moderate. There'll be other thresholds further up for poor and bad, but this is the threshold between good and moderate. So we can see that as the increasing percentage of those high soil phosphorus concentrations increases in each subcatchment, it's likely to be above a water quality threshold of 48. When we get to the lower end, we've got subcatchments below the 48 micrograms per litre in a low percentage of high soil phosphorus concentrations in the fields. And we can put a trend line through this data set and make an assumption about what's the proportion ideally of a subcatchment or a farm that can have high soil phosphorus concentrations before we get an impact on water quality. And it's around about 15% according to this model. Now those with keen eyes will see that there are only 11 data points on this chart out of 13. So 2 data points are being excluded because they act as outliers, not because they don't follow the same pattern as these catchments, but because they have different processes that we have to study in isolation. So that's something to consider, that when you're looking at such data, we don't just omit them for inconvenience or convenience. We omit them because we suspect there's some other process going on. But these data fit along the line, so we can put this model through it and say that 15% of the fields, if they're below this 26 milligrams per litre, then we can assume we'll get a reasonable water quality. So the messages are that no more than 15% of high soil P should be per subcatchment in the upper band catchment at least. Now we need to look at that for other rivers, Ballinderry, Blackwater, the Bush, and so on. So no more than 15% of high soil P per subcatchment in this river catchment. And to get to that answer, clearly what we have to do is soil test. And that's the only way around of knowing exactly if the fields are low in phosphorus, high in phosphorus, or at that sweet spot and optimally producing food without impacting water quality. So therefore knowledge is power, and what it means is a lot more fields being sampled. To that end, what's happened in the last while is a big investment in sampling field soils across Northern Ireland. So every farm, every field, every farm, every farmer will have the opportunity to avail of soil tests for available phosphorus, amongst other things, carbon, lime requirements and so on, over the next several years. And have a look at this press release down here for a bit more information on that. And it's a way of addressing the wicked problem of soil fertility versus water quality, and this soil testing really is a pathway to the sweet spot.